Welcome everyone to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversations. I'm Diana Divecha, and I'll be your moderator for a great discussion today titled How to Raise a Reader. Joining me is Pamela Paul, editor of the New York Times Book Review and author of the book How to Raise a Reader, along with 5 other books. And she's also host of the New York Times Book Review podcast. Pamela co-authored How to Raise a Reader with Maria Russo when they were both children's book editors at the New York Times. So they were reading tons of children's books, and they have 6 children between the two of them. So this is not a theoretical conversation. Pamela, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Here.
Of course, we're having this conversation 2 months into the nation's sheltering in place in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you and all your loved ones are all right there in New York.
Yes, we're very lucky.
Good, good. So this is quite a historical moment right now. Families with children are super challenged. Some are struggling to get enough food. Many are unemployed. Some have lost loved ones. Some are separated from loved ones. Many are struggling with their children's education. Do you feel like reading has a place in this time for children, or is it superfluous and just icing on the cake?
No, reading always has a place. I mean, I think it has a place for children. It has a place for adults. I think one of the central messages of our book, which I think really bears keeping in mind during this moment, is that children, as parents, when you are opening up the world of books to your child, this is not something that should be stressful. It should not feel pressured. You are giving your child a gift by opening up the world of books to them. You are bringing them into the world of stories, into the world of imagination, and into other parts of the real world. Books are a great way to forge empathy. And I think that that's something that I think a lot of us are thinking about these days, ways in which to build connections. And that's exactly what you do through books. But one other point I want to make, especially because parents are feeling a lot of pressure, understandably, to be their child's teacher right now, which is that it is the teacher's job, it's the school's job to teach your child how to read. And parents put a lot of pressure on themselves, thinking that they need to support that and be involved in that. But the most important thing to remember is that your job as a parent is to help your child learn to love to read. So you don't have to worry about that instruction. And I know that's a very difficult message right now when many kids are out of school and they are not having that, face-to-face instruction with their teachers. So whatever remote learning your child is getting through their school, that's where they're going to be learning the mechanics of how to read. And your job, again, as the parent, is to make sure that that process remains unstressed, not frustrating as much as possible, that you are showing them sort of the goalpost. You're showing them what's great about books so that when they get there and are learning to read on their own, to read independently, they have a good sense of why they should want that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the most striking sentences early in your book is you say straight up, school is where children learn to read. Home is where children learn to love to read. And at first, when I started reading the book, I thought, well, of course I value reading. Why do I need a book on encouraging reading my children? I would do that. But I just love how you sort of foreground the joy and the love and the connection and sort of background the mechanics and say, hey, they're going to learn the mechanics at school. So I love that you open the book that way. I want to say that when I first picked up the book, I was struck by, actually I had a sensory reaction at first because it's physically a beautiful book. It's kind of, just for viewers who haven't seen it yet, it's sort of a mid-size hardback. It's very silky, it's very solid in almost an old-fashioned way. The illustrations are kind of whimsical and gentle. The paper feels good. It lays open, the binding, everything, and the font. So I just love the physicality of the book. It's very pleasurable and inviting to enter.
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
it's interesting because you bring up 2 points that are kind of different ways in which we thought about the book. First of all, I agree with you about the book itself, and I'm not responsible for that. So I can just say, as an author, we were delighted with the way that the book was put together. But the guiding principle was that it should feel like something that's a keepsake, because that's the way we feel about books. These are objects to be treasured. This is something that we're hoping people can keep as a reference guide. One of the reasons we had a lot of lists of books is that, kids are constantly changing, and what you're looking for them as their interests change, as they grow, is, recommendations that are tailored to where they are. But also because the book spans from before your child really is born to when they're a teenager. So the idea is that people will be keeping it around, and we wanted it to feel durable. But another interesting thing you mentioned is that, your reaction was, of course you want your child to read, and probably being a reader yourself, many of us who are readers assume that our children will be readers too. But 2 things. One is that they aren't all necessarily, I know a lot of people who work in publishing in the book world who have kids who aren't necessarily readers. So it's not like it's necessarily something that they inherit. But also we wanted the book to be for those who didn't necessarily grow up with, in a reading family, for parents who don't necessarily read on their own, to kind of show them the beauty and the merits of it, and to really provide them an accessible path to getting there. Because if you grew up, with English is not your first language, or you weren't especially an avid reader yourself, but you know that you want that for your child, we wanted the book to be able to speak to those readers as well.
Yeah, and I will say, even as a well-educated reader, I still learned quite a bit about encouraging reading in my kids. And I'd like to transition to kind of celebrating how developmentally wise the book is. I was surprised. I'm a developmental psychologist. I've studied children's development for decades. And I was just so impressed that you seem to have really written the book from the inside out. That is, your approach to each age group sort of begins with quite a holistic understanding of what's going on developmentally. I mean, I know you're touching cognitive development, you're touching social emotional development, you're touching the development of relationships and how they see the world, but in a very light way. I can see that it's just in the infrastructure. And then you invite parents to on-ramp reading through that developmental frame. So I'd love to just walk through some of the stages and talk with you about some of the interesting guidance that you offer.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to imbue the book with that information without overburdening it. Because
Yeah.
I think one of the things you said, we did it from the inside out. Both Maria and I are parents of 3 children. And so we know how busy parents are. And a lot of parenting books can, feel very research intensive. And when you're a parent, whether you have 1 child or 4 children, you're busy. You don't necessarily have time to go through all of that research. So we didn't want to provide a lot of statistics and kind of data around these developmental milestones, but rather to kind of sew it into the fabric of what we were writing, so that it was just there to absorb, but not to have to, get through all that research on your own.
Yeah. So can we touch on a few of my favorite pieces of advice?
Absolutely.
Um, So it might come as a surprise to readers and listeners that you recommend reading to newborns 0 to 3 months. You say it doesn't matter what you read, read anything, a cookbook, a novel, a parenting manual, anything constructed of words. How come?
Well, one of the most important things to remember is that if you want to raise a reader, you need to be a reader, right? So your kids, even when they're babies, they're absorbing the fact that you're reading aloud to them, right? They are hearing your voice, they're getting your enthusiasm, your pleasure. So you could be reading what you're reading. I mean, it could be a thriller, it could be a cookbook. They don't understand the words. What they do understand is the enthusiasm in your voice. For babies, reading is a full body experience, so it's full sensory. If you're holding them, they feel the warmth of you and they associate your reading voice. I mean, when we read aloud, our cadences are different from when we're speaking. And we all know that children, babies especially, all of that is being absorbed at some very deep level. That's how babies acquire language. So they are hearing that, they're hearing that reading voice from you. They're seeing you read when they begin to see. They're feeling the warmth of your body with them, and they're developing that connection. And, also for you as a parent, it's really good training to learn how to read aloud. A lot of us don't do it on a regular basis if we don't have kids. And, when you're a new parent, everything is new. You don't really know how to do these things, how to hold a baby. You also have to kind of learn how to read aloud. And people can feel self-conscious doing that, especially if they're not a fluent reader, or if English isn't their first language, or they just, don't read aloud. They feel like a kindergarten teacher. It's an easy way to kind of get comfortable with it on your own as a parent.
Beautiful. And we have a concept, we use a language, a developmentally saturated moment. And those are those moments or those interactions where there's just so much good developmental juju happening that's delivered so naturally in such an ordinary interaction. But we know from studying it and unpacking it in minute detail that it's so important. And so newborns, the task is to sort of just be physiologically regulated, and they're just so oriented toward engaging in the human world. So there you are, holding your baby, as you say, and then giving them all of this human interaction stuff, which is language and probably eye contact or the touch, the movement of the body. Anyway, it's a beautiful saturated moment. So love that you caught that and expressed that. Then at the 2 to 3 months, you have this phrase you call babies are ready for what you call full body reading. And never come across that as a developmental stage, but it captures it exactly. As you said, they're so tactily oriented. Of course, their coordination is has a long way to go. And you mentioned in your book the series of books that don't tear and they're waterproof. So now this has become my new go-to gift for new parents, and they're wonderful. Now for preschool age children, like more in the 2 to 3 range, you say be sure to read toddlers all kinds of books. And that sounds like a simple phrase, but for me it tracks onto the explosion of brain development, the explosion of synaptogenesis that happens from 0 to 3, meaning babies come into the world with most of the brain cells that they're going to have, but what happens is this explosion of connections between them. And those connections are driven very much by their environmental experience. And what doesn't happen in the environment and won't connect or will get pruned away. So, of course, many of us are familiar with the books, the board books that are sort of concepts and categories, numbers, colors, body parts, family members, and the routines and rituals. So they're the routines and rituals of their day, going to bed or getting up or washing the dog, are named. And so they're, matching sort of the conceptual map that they're developing with their world. But you also suggest opening up topics for preschoolers. Any topic can be broken down into smaller parts and made understandable and interesting. You say art history, geology, cultures. I think that's just fantastic, and you recommend breaking down stereotypes. So that's a lot, that's a whole world delivered to young children.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying earlier about the full body experience, I think most people, when they have a baby, has experienced this really kind of delicious moment where you're holding up a board book to your baby and they kind of like face dive into it, you know, and it looks like they just want to eat the book. And then, of course, a lot of them do put the book in their mouth. And that's one of the reasons why books like Indestructibles are really good, because, and board books in general, they can be chewed at, they can be, you know, thrown, and that's all fine. That's all good. That's the child is engaging with the book. That means, you know, that they are in it. And whether, you know, another thing to think about are books that have, especially with babies and toddlers, you know, that can be, that are soft, that are fabric, that have, you know, sound effects, crinkles, and different textures. As they get older, flaps that they can open and close. They're learning those fine motor skills. You let them sort of lead the process of reading. So if they keep turning back to a page because they want you to read it again, you read it again. Even if you're ready to move on to the next page, you let them turn the pages physically as soon as they're able to do that. And then in terms of the content, it is really important to think about not just showing them their world and putting words to their world, and also showing them, it's about showing them the different ways in which their world can be represented in a book, because sometimes it's photographs, other times it's illustration, and then think about all the different kinds of illustration. The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle, you know, which is a classic, is a kind of collage gouache, you know, style of art that's very different from another book about a caterpillar that shows a photograph, or that shows it in watercolor, or that shows it in a very highly graphic, abstract way. And so you're showing your child all these different ways of artistically representing their world. But then, as you said, you want to take them outside their own world. So, you know, there's a very funny assumption that parents can make, and it's a natural one, that if you find a book that, let's say, is about the airport or flying in an airplane, and you think, well, my baby is 2, he's never been in an airplane, so this is going to be meaningless to him. You have to kind of flip that thinking and realize, but I can introduce him to that through books. Books are a way to show them, my children, worlds that they wouldn't necessarily have access to. So if you live in a city, a book is a way to show them what a farm looks like, to show them the countryside. I mean, many of us encounter animals in the pages of books well before we ever see them in real life. So it really is a way to open up their world and to make sure that they're seeing things that exist beyond their immediate environment.
So to the point of illustrations, I like your distinction that there's the Eric Carle version of a caterpillar, and then there are the National Geographic versions of a caterpillar. What do you think about when you're deciding whether you like the illustrations for young children's books?
Well, one of the most important things is to remember that it's actually not necessarily you who's the best judge, because it's your child who's going to be deciding what illustrations they like. And babies will surprise you. I mean, one of the things I think that astonishes most parents with very early board books, they're black and white. And you think, well, that's boring. But no, as you know, as a developmental psychologist, that's what babies can see. They don't see colors when they're very little. They're not going to see all of that beautiful detail and delicate, you know, pale pastel colors that we might find appealing, but they might not necessarily respond to. And this is a lesson that you will learn over and over again as a parent as your child gets older, which is that their interests and taste don't necessarily match yours. And books are a great way to get a window into what your child likes and what appeals to them and what they're thinking. So it's very often the case. And when I was the children's books editor, which was now 9 years ago, I would often bring home books to my little test group of 3 children, thinking like, this is just stunning. This is just a work of art. And they would be absolutely uninterested, So it's really interesting as a parent and as an editor to see that what appeals to me as an adult is not necessarily going to appeal to a 5-year-old girl or a 3-year-old boy. They all have their own sort of take on it.
Mm-hmm. So
But one of the things I will say is very important as a parent when you are judging illustration is to really think about the relationship between the text on the page to the picture, because you want to make sure that you don't have too many words on the page for your child to be read to at that age. And it's also important to remember that when you are reading aloud a story to a child, a picture book, there are 2 stories that are being told. There's the story that's being told in the text, and that's the one you're reading aloud. And then there's a completely different story often in the pictures. And I think most parents have the experience where you're reading aloud a story to your child, and suddenly they'll laugh. And you'll think, I didn't read anything funny, but they're seeing a different story in the pictures. So they're reading that story visually, and there might be something funny hidden there in the pictures. Some of the great author illustrators, meaning the people who both illustrate and write, because sometimes that role is, there's an author and an illustrator who operate separately, but some of the great author and illustrators will, do this in a very organic way where they're writing the story as a kind of companion to the images, and they're very purposefully setting the stories in kind of contrast and working them together.
I love that idea that your child isn't always reading quite the same story that you think you're reading. When you notice that as a parent, I think sometimes the impulse is to pull them onto your track.
Yes.
Rather than noticing that moment and the parent making an internal shift and saying to oneself, oh, and getting curious. And let's do a deep dive into what you see. And I'm thinking of, some questions that maybe would be helpful for parents at that moment. Something like, what do you think will happen next? Or why do you think that happened? Or how do you think that person feels? Or do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, books are a great way to have a conversation with your child. I think, there are 2 impulses that parents can fall into when you're reading aloud to your child, and they're very different kind of traps. One is, as the reader, especially once you get comfortable, you get very carried away with your own performance, right? So you're doing like the crazy ogre voice and the silly princess voice, and your child might not necessarily respond to that. And so you can have, your child will interrupt and say, can we go back to that? And your impulse as a kind of performer reader is to be like, no, I'm in the middle of this. Like, we're going to keep going. So allow your child to interrupt. Don't get too carried away with your performance. If they don't like that silly princess voice and ask you to stop, which they will, and that's good, because that, again, you want them to take the lead. And the other thing that can happen is that we become, many of us are reading to our children at the end of a long day, whether we're working in the home or outside the home. You can feel like, oh my God, let this just be done. And so sometimes you just want to get to the end of the book, or you might have a pile of 4 books that your child wants to read and you just want to get through them. And I would say, remember really to slow down and to let your child, so what if you only read 1 book that night? If your child wants to read it 4 times, or if they want to go back to the beginning, or they say, I don't understand what happened here, or they have questions, again, let them lead, because it really isn't about getting to the end of the story. It's about enjoying the story they are in and making the most of that experience.
Right. And they are actively engaging in the co-construction of their own ideas. And so we need to slow down and open that up. Otherwise, what is the point?
Right. I mean, every story exists differently for every reader. And even for the same reader, it exists differently at different moments in time. And we as adults know this because if you've read a book in your 20s and then you've gone back to it in your 40s, you often find it's a very different reading experience. I mean, the example I love is Anna Karenina, because if you read Anna Karenina in your 20s, you think like, this is so romantic. You know, she's leaving him for Vronsky. It's true love. And then if you read it in your 30s, let's say, and you're newly married and maybe you have a baby, you think, this is terrible. She's leaving her husband and abandoning her child. This is a horrible, tragic thing. And then, maybe you read it late in life and you've been through, some life experience and you read it and you say, you know what, this is kind of understandable. Maybe why this happened. So it really is about where you as a reader are at. If you think about that from a child's perspective, children are changing so rapidly that even 4 months from, reading the book for the first time, they're going to read it in a different way. They're going to hear it in a different way, which is one of the reasons why rereading is so good for kids, no matter what age they are.
Mm-hmm. So to that same point, you take care for children who are beginning to learn to read to advise parents to not correct their reading. You say when he or she reads out loud, listen respectfully, don't interrupt, try to hold back on correcting him unless it's absolutely crucial to understanding the story. I love that distinction. And again, you're backgrounding the mechanics and foregrounding the real meaning, the deeper experience, the joy and pleasure of the moment.
Yeah, I mean, when kids are learning how to read, we have to remember that this is a very stressful period for them, learning how to read. And one of the reasons it's stressful, even if you as a parent are not putting any pressure on them to learn how to read, they know that reading is important. They know because their schools are emphasizing it. They know because even if the teacher isn't explicitly telling them you are not doing as well as your classmates, they know if they're in group K and everyone else in their peer group is in, group P in the leveled readers, or if they're on level 1 readers and everyone else is reading level 3. So there's a lot of pressure that sort of occurs in the classroom and that occurs just in our culture that, I'm 6 years old or I'm 7 years old, I should be reading now. And so that if they are struggling, the last thing you want to do as the parent where you're trying to make sure that in your home, reading is about pleasure and not pressure, is to add any kind of additional self-consciousness or stress to that situation. So you don't want to be correcting your child if they're reading aloud. And if they ask, of course, you can say, oh no, that this is the way that you read, that this is the way that word sounds, and maybe show them how. But again, you don't want to be pushing them in any way, because the child who is struggling how to read, right? If they begin to feel pressured and frustrated, they might label themselves. They might self-label as like, oh, I'm not a good reader, or I'm not a reader, or books aren't my thing. So you want to make sure that you, again, are keeping the emphasis on the positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen children actually, I think go into a kind of fear response and start to hide and even start lying because they couldn't read, but they couldn't also admit to it. So yeah, it's quite delicate. And I think, at this moment when a lot of families are feeling a lot of pressure around maintaining their children's education, I think it's, it's extra helpful to hear that reminder that, the eye on the prize is really tracking their joy and their engagement and not their performance.
Yes. And that's a reason why one of the things that we talk about in the book is not rewarding reading. You never want to give them a prize for reading. They don't get to have dessert if they finish their book or get an extra hour on the iPad, because what that's telling them is that reading is work. Reading is something obligatory. Reading is what you do in order to get the fun thing. You want the message to be that reading is the reward. This is the fun thing. This is the pleasure. This is not something that you have to get through. This is something that you want to sink into and enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Right. It keeps them connected to their intrinsic pleasure.
Yes. It's the difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, which is that punishment and that reward.
Yes. Yes. You write that children's books should be both mirrors and windows. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a famous pedagogical concept, and I'm not the person who came up with that, but it is a very popular notion, and it's really taken hold because what it means essentially is that you want books to reflect back on your child who they are. That means what they look like, that means what their family looks like, that means what their experience feel like, so that they feel validated. That's one of the reasons why diversity in children's book publishing is so important, because if you don't have children of all different colors on the page, all different ethnicities and countries of origin and family kinds, that they don't then see themselves as they don't see books as being part of their world. They think of books as something for those people, for other people. I mean, back in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, there were very few pictures of non-white children in books. And there were a couple of books that were notable exceptions, Corduroy, and of course, Ezra Jack Keats's The Snowy Day. But there were very few books that featured diverse characters, especially in everyday situations where the point wasn't, okay, this is about this particular ethnic group or this particular racial group or whatever it might be, but just showing kids of all different colors, kids with different family configurations, doing the things that every kid does. So that's really important in terms of mirroring. But windows are also why it's important for kids who are white to see Black children in books, to see Latino children in books, because this is the world they are entering. You are giving them a window into a world that even if they live, and very few kids now do live in a non-diverse environment because this is the world that we are living in, but even if they aren't directly experiencing these things, they are seeing them in books. They're getting a window into another world. As an adult, when I think about what I like to read books that are transportative. I like to read books in order to access experiences that I can never have and will never have, whether it's because it's a book about a 19th century coal miner in France or a book about someone who lives on Mars. These are not things, whether they're realistic or fantasy, that I'm ever going to experience. I'm not a superhero, but it doesn't mean that I wouldn't want to read about one. And kids are the same way. And you want to make sure, again, that you are showing them both their own world and their own experiences and validating it, and then also the experiences of others. And I mentioned earlier, that books are the great empathy builder. And that's really why, because it's empathizing both with their own experience, showing that this author understands you, this book gets you. But also, this is an experience that this child is nothing like you. This character is nothing like you. And yet, perhaps you can relate to them because you've experienced loss in some other way, or you've experienced joy in some other way, and therefore you create that connection.
I have a mixed race family, and my kids are adults now. But when they found some books as elementary school children that reflected their experience and showed kids like themselves, they lived those books for a period of time, like months. They dressed like those characters. So it's not about checking a box. It's about having an opportunity or another channel in which to really work out one's inner experience in relation to the world that they live in.
Yeah. And I think, that's also really important in terms of gender, to be able to see the wide spectrum, to be able to see, one of the lists that we have in the book is about strong boy characters and strong girl characters. And by that, I mean, Maria and I were really looking for books that maybe showed sides of what's considered male and what's considered female that aren't often celebrated in books. That there's a shy, introverted, non-athletic boy who nonetheless has great resources of empathy or leadership that aren't tapped yet. And there are the girls who are physically strong and forceful and maybe stubborn or display anger, but do it in a a positive way. Like, it's really important to be able to show that, to show things that exist beyond the stereotypes. And again, that was really rare. I think until the 70s, you had a kind of nice moment where some authors really did, in that Free to Be You and Me era, kind of take a more open look at gender. But then in the 80s and the 90s, even, it sort of closed back up again, and you saw a lot of books until really quite recently that were like the boys' book of stories and the girls' this, and very gendered sort of sort of a black and white way of seeing the way real kids operate in the world.
Mm-hmm. One of my new favorite picture books that I've been gifting is Julian is a what is it?
Julian is a mermaid.
Julian is a mermaid. Yeah. Love that book about a sort of gender fluid child who wants to dress as a mermaid, and how they find or how they're led by a special character in their life to be able to express that.
I mean, it's interesting because the most banned books list just came out, showing which books are banned most often, and LGBTQ storylines and characters were, the issue in 8 of the 10 top most banned books in the country. So there clearly is still, a lot of objections, but I think it's very important for books to continue to reflect that, especially for kids who grew up in areas or in families or communities where that isn't as accepted, because again, that enables them to feel seen. And what's wonderful, again, in terms of reading, is that it's books that are showing them that world. It's books that are making them feel accepted. And I think for a lot of us who become lifelong readers, it's because we felt comfortable in the world of books. We felt seen. We felt like that's the place where I want to go. I mean, one of the reasons why older kids will reread and reread and reread the same book over again, and you think like, enough Harry Potter. Why do you want to read this for the 10th time? It's because they want to enter that world. They want to be in that world. Who wouldn't want to be in Hogwarts sometimes instead of, here in a plain old non-magical Earth? So, it's that idea that books can be a refuge for kids.
Mm-hmm. And there are also very significant developmental themes woven into the Harry Potter series. I remember one of them, not remembering exactly which one at the moment, but really delved into the question of, am I good or am I bad?
Yes.
So then it's incredibly juicy when it has all of this going on in one book.
I mean, the Harry Potter books are also on that top 10 banned list of books, I think in part because of the witchcraft and magical elements. But an interesting thing about those books is that J.K. Rowling wrote those books to grow with her readers. So the first 4 books are middle grade books, which means they're generally for children 8 to 12, although I would argue that it's probably 10, 11 is the sweet spot. And then when Cedric dies, and I hope I'm not giving a plot spoiler there to people, but when a character dies at the end of book 4 and he's a good guy, he doesn't deserve to die. That's a very dark moment for kids. It's a very dark moment because that's not what, most kids read about in middle grade fiction. In middle grade fiction, the lines of good and evil are sort of drawn, and there's a moral and there's a reason for things. And this is totally unreasonable. And that marks the transition of those books to YA, to age 12 and up. And the last 3 books are all kinds of issues that, middle schoolers and high schoolers experience in terms of romance and betrayal and bullying. So one thing that's really important to remember is that even in fantasy, these children's books authors are exploring very real emotions for kids. And so, and that can be more comfortable for a lot of kids to sort of delve into when it's in a fantastical world, or when it's in, for example, a world of animals. And one of the great things about animal characters is that there's no gender, right? So anyone can relate to a rabbit or a wolf or a dragon, because it doesn't necessarily the animal or the magical creature might have the same emotional experiences, but they obviously don't look like you.
So you mentioned the young adult phase. Can you describe what's going on in that genre? I mean, I've always seen sections of the bookstore, section of the library labeled young adult, but I have a feeling there's something new and rich going on in that genre. Can you speak
It's
to
a
that?
huge area of growth. I mean, think about it. Probably when you were a kid, certainly when I was a kid, there was no YA. That no one knew what that acronym meant, young adult books. What happened was you went from these kind of really bad romances like Sweet Dreams and Sweet Valley High, and then nothing. So what kids like I did was you would read Danielle Steele or Sidney Sheldon or Stephen King or, V.C. Andrews, Flowers in the Attic, which is about like incestuous children locked up. So it was nothing good. There was nothing that was really specifically for teenagers. And that whole area has just exploded. And what's really terrific about it, I would say there's sort of two major threads. They're the realistic books, and there's the fantasy books, and both of them get at children emotionally, but in different ways. And so the realistic fiction is doing a really great job of reflecting very real world situations, whether it's issues around Me Too or cyberbullying or gender identity or racism. And those authors have really been on the vanguard in terms of, things happen in YA even before they really happen in adult fiction, but it's written for teenagers. And that's really important because a lot of people think, well, I don't want my child to read about heroin addiction. I don't want my child to read about opiates or about rape. And you think, really? Because they're going to learn about that. Would you rather them learn about that like online or on YouTube? Or would you rather them learn about it in a book that's been written thoughtfully, contextualized by editors, that really works hard to speak in an appropriate way to a teenage audience? The other thing about YA is that the authors know what they're up against. They're up against TikTok. They're up against Instagram. They're up against Fortnite. And so those books have to like grab you emotionally in the first few pages or have a plot that just moves so quickly that they lure readers in. So they're very plot driven. They're highly emotional. They really get inside the mind of teenagers. And that's one of the reasons why they've taken off. But another funny thing about them is that 1/3 of the readers are adults and young adults of YA. And it is because these books are written really well. It's easy to dismiss them and underestimate them. But, if your child is reading even a book that you might consider kind of schlocky, that's targeted to their age, be happy they're reading. Let them read what they want. They have so many other choices. They could be going on to Hulu. They could be on their phone. They could be chatting with all of their friends on House Party. Be happy that they're choosing to read. And that gets back to what we were talking about earlier with intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. If you don't think about early on instilling that intrinsic motivation, then later on, when your child has all the options in the world of what to do with their limited leisure time, they're not going to choose to read if they don't love it.
So to that point, the Pew Research Center just, in their most recent time analysis that they released, where they analyzed how young teenagers spend their time, they are on their screens 3 hours a day. So it seems like the elephant in the room in this conversation is, what do we do about that competition that we have with screens? And I feel like you actually had a surprisingly, to me, a nuanced approach or nuanced attitude about engagement with technology over the ages, actually.
It really does depend on the age, and it depends on the family, and everybody will have their own approach. But a couple of things. So first of all, when your children are really young, it's important to remember you're in charge. You set the rules. Doesn't matter what their friends are doing. It doesn't matter what the sort of greater culture is doing. You have to figure out, this is the way our family operates. And then you really have to live by it. So you have to remember too, again, when I talked about if you want to raise a reader, be a reader. If you're saying to your kids, guys, put the screens away, and then you're scrolling on your phone and you're saying it's reading time, think about that mixed message. So make sure your kids see you reading. And if you do set a rule, like let's say you have a household rule that says, okay, all devices, all screens away at 8 o'clock, we're done. That holds for the grownups too. So you can't be like sneaking in your home office to look at your work email. If that's the rule you've set, then you need to abide by it. But, I think also there are some encouraging things about technology and about kids' response to technology. And I think a lot of parents are seeing that firsthand right now during quarantine. Their kids are on screens probably a lot more than many people are necessarily comfortable with. But you will note that your kids, first of all, they have to be on screens for school. And so it becomes kind of associated with work. I think what's very interesting when you talk about surveys show that teenagers prefer print books to ebooks. They prefer it because they're on screens all the time. And screens for them are about social life or they're about schoolwork. So when they want to read a story, they want to immerse themselves. They want to really dive in. And kids are collectors. Teenagers are collectors. They want to own those books. They want to have them all. They want to shelve them in their own way, on their own bookshelf, in their room. So, there are some encouraging things that are really coming from kids themselves. And I would also say that if your child is a big reader, screens can also open up some interesting avenues for them that didn't exist when I was growing up. When I was growing up, if you wanted to get in touch with Judy Blume, like dream on, you could never get in touch with Judy Blume. You could send a snail mail, maybe to their publisher, maybe Judy would write back. I don't know, but Judy Blume is on Twitter. Judy Blume is online. You could send her a message. She might not respond to you, but you can actually connect with her. Or if you're reading a series of books and you don't know any other kids that are reading that series, let's say you're reading Wings of Fire, which is a great series about dragons for both boys and girls by Twee Sutherland. You can go onto the Scholastic website. You can find the Wings of Fire section. You can find chat rooms to connect with other Wings of Fire fans. There are games that you can play there. There are clubs that you can take part in. You can see your authors. I mean, right now, especially during quarantine, a lot of children's books authors are getting online. They're getting out there in order to reach their readers because they can't be in bookstores. They can't be in libraries. So again, these screens can be a way of actually connecting with other readers and connecting with authors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you also recommended for the young ages, you're not opposed to audiobooks.
Audiobooks are great. Audiobooks are great. Audiobooks look at storytelling, that's the way these stories began for the most part, with an oral tradition. And audiobooks are a great way to enjoy a story together, whether you're in the car or you decide to create a ritual with your family. You turn out the lights, you light candles, you put on the story. It's a way to reach across ages. There are some great books that can, be equally entertaining for a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old, whether it's, a great E.B. White or The One and Only Ivan by Catherine Applegate, or a Roald Dahl story, or The Lord of the Rings or Greek myths. There are all kinds of ways in which you can enjoy them together. And I want to say one other thing about audiobooks, which is that it's a great way for kids who are dyslexic or who have actual reading challenges, mechanical challenges with reading, and they can't read on the page a book that matches where they are intellectually. So it's a way that they can continue to get stories that really speak to them and who they are as a sort of full person. That isn't necessarily tied to their ability to read a text on the page.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that a lot of authors are coming online at this time. That's fantastic. And even I find that I'm looking for somebody reading poetry at the end of the day because I don't want to listen to the news and so forth. Do you have any other recommendations for kids who are at home now, who they can't afford to order books on Amazon and the libraries are closed? Any other suggestions for these kids?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of free material right now online, and there are things that are in, that are past copyright that you can access online. There are lots of libraries and bookstores and literacy organizations making even more texts available online. I mentioned earlier, there are great writers and illustrators like Mo Willems and Mac Barnett. They're going online. They're reading aloud their stories. They're doing story time hours sort of virtually. So it's a great place for kids to gain access to those books. And there's still ways to order books, I will say. and places that are making stories available for free that wouldn't have. So even for parents who can't afford to necessarily buy books new, I want to say, one of the great things about the internet is that it gives you access to used books. And there is, in a way that is much easier than it was before. If you didn't have a used bookstore in town, or a library that does library sales, you can get books very inexpensively online. And, let's face it, most kids destroy their picture books and their board books within weeks anyway. So it doesn't matter if it doesn't look perfect upon arrival. It's still the story that counts.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been absolutely wonderful having this conversation with you. And I really appreciate that, one of the big themes that we've woven through here is how the cultivating a love of reading, the joy of reading, matters a lot to the children's development of themselves in very profound ways. And I was wondering if you could read for me a passage from your book that I think really captures that and is a nice way to sort of lift off.
Sure. Okay, so this is from the introduction of the book. Mm-hmm. Whatever life out there holds for them, they will be more ready for it, having indulged in the stories held within books. They will understand storyline and plot twists and happy endings. They will know about character development and underlying themes and sad endings as well. Through the novels they read, they will know more about the stories they want to be a part of, what kind of character they might be. They'll be better prepared to read situations and to understand context and to search for meaning in the face of the seemingly incomprehensible. They will know how to break a story down to its essential elements and draw conclusions. They will be able to read people and situate themselves and others in the world. My hope is that they will seize on books as their own lifelines and share their stories with others.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Pamela Paul for joining us today. At the end of this talk, there'll be a link as to where you can buy How to Raise a Reader and have it shipped directly to you. I'm Diana Divecha, and you've been watching Bay Area Book Festival Unbound.